Tonight, Senator Bob Menendez joins us, the New Jersey Democrat. He's on the Foreign Relations Committee. We're going to talk about, among other things, Iran and his bill aiming to try and stop the Russians from meddling in our next election. Also, the Attorney General William Barr, he appoints a prosecutor to look into the origins of the Mueller Probe. The president is thrilled. Democrats, as you'd imagine, not. Tonight, we look at how this all could play out with a former federal prosecutor. Then, a Democrat who won a Senate seat in deep red Alabama. He joins us. Senator Doug Jones. He's on RFL. Good evening and welcome to Richard French Live. I am Richard French. Attorney General William Barr, he is now investigating the investigators. Barr, he's assigned a federal prosecutor in Connecticut to take a look into the origins of the Russia probe. President Trump, he's been calling for that for months. But when he was asked about that today, listen to what he had to say.
I think it's a great thing that he did it. I saw it last night, and they want to look at how that whole hoax got started. It was a hoax. I am so proud of our Attorney General that he is looking into it. I think it's great. I did not know about it.
But what you just heard from the president is only part of the story. There are many reports today that the president actually directed the AG to do it. We will, as they say, stay tuned to the origins of the ask. It is hardly the only new development we are learning today. In a federal court in Washington, lawyers for the president, they tried to block his accounting firm from turning over financial records to the House Oversight Committee. Now, those records were subpoenaed, but then Trump sued to block the subpoena. This matter was not resolved today, so they are still fighting out. But the judge, if you read the tea leaves, seemed to be skeptical about the Trump team's argument. Plus, the House Intelligence Committee, they're now investigating whether the attorneys tied to the president's family helped to obstruct justice by hampering the committee's investigation. Now, all this revolves around former Trump personal attorney Michael Cohen. By the way, Cohen, as you know, he's in federal prison as we speak. The Intel Committee, they're looking into whether or not lawyers for Trump worked with Cohen to deliver false testimony. Then we get to Donald Trump Jr. He's been subpoenaed by the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee. He's been arguing to this point he's not going to show. Some Republicans even say plead the fifth or just ignore the subpoena. Well, we learned just minutes ago, per the Times, that a deal has been struck for Donnie Jr. to make a limited appearance in mid-June for a private interview with the committee members and perhaps for just a few hours. This after Trump had reportedly agreed to a pair of previously scheduled meetings but didn't show up. Former federal prosecutor Stephen Mulroy joins us now. Just a slow day in Washington, right?
Yes.
Well, let me start with exactly. Let me just start with the last one, Stephen, related with Donnie Jr. I guess it depends on how you look at it. This is not the subject matter will be more defined. That the last will only be for a few hours. It certainly won't be an all-day thing, and this will not be for live Technicolor TV. That said, the president and all the ones attached to him said he's not showing, make no plans. He won't even step foot in front of any Senate committee. In terms of who you think blinked most, given that there is an arrangement, which party gave in?
Well, given that the original position of the administration was no cooperation whatsoever, they were going to fight all the subpoenas, and then it would look like the Trump administration made the biggest concession by having Donald Jr. even appear for a few hours. The idea of having it behind closed doors rather than in public is not necessarily that significant a concession on the part of Congress, if really what they're after is the truth and not making headlines. Now, limiting the interview to only a few hours might be problematic if he decides to filibuster and stonewall and try to run out the clock. But I think on balance, this development, which is surprising, indicates, I think, probably that the administration gave in more than anyone would have expected them to, and probably more than Congress did.
This next one also, depending on a read of it, and I've had enough attorneys and former prosecutors tell me, do not read tea leaves based off of questions of judges, et cetera. That all said, by most reporting, the federal judge involved in the hearing as to whether or not the Trump accounting firm has to hand over the financial records seem to be more than skeptical of the argument by Trump's attorneys that that should be privileged, given some black letter law. What's your read on how this plays out?
Well, I think whoever it was you were talking to is exactly right. You really are in trouble if you try to read too much into the tone of a judge's question. On the other hand, on the merits, it doesn't seem like there are a lot of strong arguments, strong bases for the Trump organization to block the disclosure of these records. It seems like it's the kind of thing that Congress would routinely be able to get into. So I wouldn't be a bit surprised if the judge ends up ruling against Trump on that particular case.
And Stephen, barring some revelation about some financial stakes or relationships with oligarchs or some unsavory folks that led to that long suspected possible money laundering, assuming there's none of that, but it does show that the emperor has no clothes in terms of whether it be net worth, whether it be the amount of losses, no taxes being paid or whatever. The real exposure potentially for the president and I guess the Trump organization is they don't have nearly as much money as they've been saying for this. This is really more the risk of embarrassment more than anything else, correct?
Well, certainly there is the risk of political embarrassment to demonstrate and document just how overblown Trump's claims have been over the last several decades about how much money he had and what his net worth have. It's certainly embarrassing to show the kind of sustained year after year losses that where we saw with the limited disclosure of the tax records. But there might be some legal relevance here in that if there's assets or income that was not properly disclosed or is being hidden, then there are both state and federal tax law implications. And B, if it's the other way around and there actually was more, it looked on paper that there was more value than there really was, well, then that could get into some fraud because they were using arguably inflated claims of assets and income in order to obtain loans.
The president seemingly, maybe for the first time, but chose his words carefully when asked about the genesis of the Barr investigation into the investigators, if you will, that he never called on him to do that, despite some of the reports to the contrary that he had directed as much. We had talked about in the recent days that he had asked McGahn also to speak publicly, that there was no obstruction to make those statements for which McGahn refused to do at the time. If it does turn out, Steve, that the president said, hey, Barr, I want you to go investigate this, that, or the other thing, basically using the AG as his personal attorney, more than unsavory. Is that problematic for the president in terms of how the separation of powers is supposed to work?
It's politically problematic, and your word unseemly, in that there is this norm or tradition of the Department of Justice being apolitical, and that individual prosecution and investigation decisions really are supposed to be divorced from politics. I don't know if there's anything necessarily illegal about suggesting to your attorney general that a certain investigation be started, but it certainly does have the appearance of the Department of Justice being used for political retaliation purposes, which is obviously not what the Department of Justice is there for.
And within that same area code, finally, the idea, I always try and say, if you just parachuted in here and didn't get bombarded by the last 2 years of the daily fire hose of crazy, the idea that after the Mueller report, which details 10 to 11 at least examples of possible obstruction of justice, let alone all the other information that we've learned, with all the other ongoing probes, that the Attorney General of the United States would prioritize right now, this is what I want to use my office on. I want to learn about the origins of the investigation that I think by any rational person would say turned up some really problematic stuff. How much does that tell you how damaged we are in terms of, I don't know, justice being, the referee in this rather than wearing shirts or skins?
Right. Well, we've heard, you're right, exactly. And we've heard that phrase before about defining deviancy down. And it just seems like every month we reach a new low. and our expectations get lower, and we almost are immune to shock. But to think about it, you mentioned the volume 2 of the Mueller report, which showed the 10 instances of you know arguable obstruction of justice. There's also volume 1, which documented so numerous and extensive and comprehensive attempts by Russia to interfere in the 2016 election, which was the initial point of why we had the Mueller investigation to begin with, leading to dozens of indictments and scores of documented contacts with Russia and the Trump campaign, not to mention the instances of possible obstruction that you referred to. You add all that up, the idea that we have to investigate the investigators and launch an investigation into why we started the Mueller investigation, it really boggles the mind.
And that's probably the best way to put it here, but what we've come to accept, or as you say, defining deviancy down. Steve, I always appreciate a few minutes from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Now, we just talked about there at the end the idea of Russian interference. It's not a theory anymore, it's a proven fact. When we come back, Senator Bob Menendez, he'll join us, and he's got a plan to beef up our election security as we learn even more about the hacking that was done by the Russians in 2016. New headlines that came out late today.